Hi there, I'm Dr. Vivian Lowe, and you're on vlmd Rounds, a podcast on medical science and tools to optimize your health. Today's episode is a special one. I'm making this one for my friend Carmelina Luongo, and she is an excellent OBGYN doctor. Carmen and I have had many discussions about the metabolic health of women. And I asked her, Carm, what do your patients want to know about women and metabolic health? And what do you want your patients to know? And she gave me a list of questions. And basically they are, what happens to women metabolically when they go into menopause? Why weight loss seems more difficult in menopause, and the best long-term weight loss strategies for women. And then there was something that she also wanted me to tell women in general. I'll work that into the episode. Let's go. So obviously, let's just start with the regulation of sex hormones in your body. And we have something called the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, or the HPA axis. And this is a fancy name for the communication between your brain and your gonads, which are your reproductive organs. So that would be the testes in men, and in women, that would be the ovaries, right? And basically, a part of your brain called the hypothalamus produces gonadotropin releasing hormone, which then stimulates another part of the brain, the anterior pituitary, to produce gonadotropins. And these have names like FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone. These are going to actually stimulate the gonads or the reproductive organs to produce sex hormones. In women, the ovaries would produce estrogen during the follicular phase of the menstrual cycle, and the ovaries produce estrogen and progesterone during what we call the luteal phase, luteal, and this is when you have your period, when you have your menses, okay? Now, the main circulating estrogen in your body is something called 17-beta estradiol. Fancy name, don't have to worry about it. That's just the main circulating estrogen, okay? And when this estradiol binds to the target organs, it binds to the special receptors that are called nuclear receptors. So we have these nuclear receptors that are estrogen receptors. When estrogen binds to it, this whole complex can now migrate to the nucleus. And there, it's going to bring about transcription of genes. And in this way, we can activate or turn off certain genes in your body. So very powerful, because it's going to turn on or turn off genes in your body. Now, progesterone, besides being made in the ovaries, can also be made in the adrenal glands, and these are little glands that sit on top of your kidneys. And also during pregnancy, they're made in the placenta. So we have high levels of progesterone during pregnancy. And, you know, it acts through these nuclear progesterone receptors. So very similar to the estrogen receptor, the progesterone binds to these progesterone receptors, and that whole complex migrates again to the nucleus. And there it can turn on or turn off certain genes. And of course, when we get to menopause, then we're going to have the ovaries shut down. So we're going to have decreased production of the hormones that are made by the ovaries, particularly estrogen. And what we'll see is now the ratio of androgens, or the male type hormones, and the female hormones, there's going to be a change in that ratio. So the androgen to estrogen ratio is going to increase. So we have more influence of the male type hormones. Now, what we know is that with menopause, definitely you're going to see an increase in fat mass. All right, so your percent body fat will increase with menopause. Now, interestingly, weight and BMI are going to increase, but really not very much. Okay, you're actually going to get much more fat gain, but you're not going to notice it as much in the weight. And this is because at the same time, you will be losing lean mass. And this would mean muscle and also bone. Okay, so now imagine if at menopause you lose 5 pounds of muscle and you gain 5 pounds of fat. Well, you're going to be weight neutral. If you step on the scale, you're going to be the same weight. It's going to look like, oh, all things are great because I didn't gain any weight. Not so, because you've lost muscle, which is metabolically active tissue. I did a whole episode on that. Episode 4, you can go check in on that one. But that's going to help you actually increase your metabolism, right? The more muscle you have. And you just lost 5 pounds of muscle, and instead you've gained 5 pounds of fat. So even though the weight stays the same, you are now very different metabolically. And guess what? These changes occur 1 to 2 years prior to menopause. So you don't have to wait till menopause. Around the perimenopausal period or that menopause transition period, you're already starting to see these changes in your body. Now, in normal aging, we do see fat mass, total fat mass, go up, and there's a peak between the ages of 65 to 70 years of age. Generally, women, in all phases of their life tend to have more fat than men. So we have higher percent body fat. And it turns out that most of this fat, especially in the premenopausal phase, is going to be subcutaneous fat. By this we mean fat that is right under the skin. And how can you tell if you have subcutaneous fat or not? Well, subcutaneous fat is pinchable fat. So, those muffin tops and anywhere else on your body that you can pinch the fat, that's subcutaneous because it's right under the skin, which is why you can pinch it. Now, in contrast, you can have fat that's inside the abdominal cavity, inside the belly, inside the muscle walls, right? And that in the belly area is called visceral fat, visceral. Visceral fat is fat that is around the intestines and also around the organs. And visceral fat is a subset of ectopic fat. Ectopic just means, it's out of place. So it's fat where fat should not be. Normally, you should have fat in fat tissue, which is that subcutaneous fat, right? So that in periods of famine, let's say you don't get enough food, you still have an energy supply. We can call on those fat reserves to supply you with energy. You're really not supposed to have fat inside your abdominal cavity, especially in organs like your liver, in organs like your pancreas. You shouldn't have fat in your lungs, right? And yet, if we have metabolic disturbances in our body, we're going to start increasing the deposits of fat in those areas. Now, interestingly, men have that more rounded apple shape, and the fat that they have tend to be inside the belly, but then women have more of the pear-shaped, and this means that they have more subcutaneous fat in the hips, in the glutes, and also in the thighs, right? However, when we get to menopause, all this is going to change. And we're really going to start to see different deposits of fat in women at the menopause transition. So Sowers et al. In 2007 in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism, they did a study and they showed that over 6 years from menopause, there were changes in the body composition of women such that there was a lot more fat mass in those women. Now, weight gain, as I said before, wasn't really impressive. Over the 6 years, it was about 3.4 kilograms or 7.5 pounds. And, that's not a huge amount because the fat mass had increased a whole lot more than the weight or the BMI because of the concomitant lean mass or muscle loss, okay? And again, at the start of menopause, Greendale et al. In JCI Insight 2019 found that fat mass actually doubled, and lean mass dropped. So there was a 6% total gain in fat mass over 3.5 years in the menopause transition period. And again, there was also that not very impressive weight gain because, again, you're losing the muscle, but you're gaining fat. Now, as I said, when you're premenopausal, you tend to have more subcutaneous fat. But you change that, you start to accumulate more of the visceral fat, the ectopic fat, after menopause. So premenopausal women, roughly 5 to 8% of the total body fat is coming from the visceral fat. But when you get to menopause, 15 to 20% of the total fat is now coming from the visceral fat, from that ectopic fat. More disturbingly, they have done CT scans and looked at the fat deposits around the heart. Okay, this is the pericardial and epicardial fat. And generally we have a little bit of fat around the heart because, you kind of need a little bit of a padding to be protective around the heart. But you really shouldn't have a whole lot of fat surrounding the heart. But with menopause, we see a much increased deposit now of fat around the heart. And this correlates with the increased risk of heart disease in women, right, post-menopausally. We find that the metabolic impact is directly related to ectopic fat, the fat that's in the wrong place, and not just fat gain. And this is especially true for what we call medial spinal fat or fat that's in the chest, right? Pericardial and epicardial fat. Again, that's the fat around the heart. We do see a significant increase, all right? With increase of visceral fat deposits, we're also going to have increased chronic inflammation in the body because visceral fat is essentially sick fat, right? It's fat that is in places it shouldn't be. So it's, for example, in the liver, okay? Now, you really shouldn't have fat in your liver, and yet now we have a huge rise in fatty liver all over the world. And Carm wanted me to tell all of you that fatty liver is one of the leading causes of liver failure globally. And I did do a whole episode on fatty liver, so you can look that one up. But basically, when you have fat accumulation in the liver, it causes a lot of inflammation, and that can lead to hepatitis, right? Yes, from the fat alone. And then that can lead to scarring or cirrhosis of the liver. Eventually, when you have a non-functioning liver, you're going to need a liver transplant. But, just having fatty liver and some fibrosis or scarring in the liver from the inflammation is going to increase your risk of liver cancer as well. So once you have fatty liver, you are at high risk for diabetes, but also liver cancer, hepatitis, liver failure. All right, so I wanted to make that point because that was something Carm requested for this episode. But you can check out the liver episode that I did, specifically on liver fibrosis and fatty liver. All right, so this visceral fat, as I said, is highly inflammatory, and what we notice is now you're in a state of chronic inflammation because you have more of this visceral fat. Now, it turns out that immune cells in your body, such as macrophages and monocytes, these are different types of immune cells, and they actually are activated by estrogen through their estrogen receptors. So they actually have estrogen receptors in them, and they can interact with estrogen. And there is an inverse association between estrogen and inflammation, such that the lower the estrogen levels, the higher the inflammation. All right. So we see activation of those immune cells, and we see more inflammatory substances produced by those immune cells, such that postmenopausal women have a lot more of these, activated immune cells secreting all these inflammatory substances that can cause a lot of problems in your body, including increasing your risk for cancer. Right? So that's one thing that I think people don't think about when they think about fat. They think that, oh, maybe it doesn't look good, and they don't feel comfortable with it. But it's also, chronically raising inflammation in your body. That's not good. So far I've talked a lot about the visceral fat, right? But excessive subcutaneous fat, right? That fat that is generally seen as the healthier fat, right under the skin. Excessive amounts of subcutaneous fat can also have its consequences. So you might be interested to know that fat cells live about 10 years. So sometimes people say, oh, when you have fat cells, they just kind of stay in your body forever and you can't make any new fat cells. That's not true. You're making new fat cells, all right? But they do live a long time, roughly about 10 years or so in your body, depending on where the fat is. Now, we have stem cells, and we make new fat cells from these stem cells. And for fat cells, you have different lineages. You have some stem cells that will make white fat, your general, fat deposits, and also something we call beige fat. I did do an episode on that. You can listen to that one. But beige fat is fat that can change from white to brown characteristics, right? And brown fat is a very specific kind of fat. So as I said, we have stem cells that can make white fat and also beige fat. Now we have different lineages of stem cells that make more like the muscle cells in your body. And from that muscle lineage, we can also make a type of fat called brown fat. Brown fat is different in that it has a lot more mitochondria in it, and that's why it looks brown. And basically, it's highly metabolic. And what it does is it takes in fuel, right? The fuel, the food that you eat, and it converts it to energy in the form of heat. So brown fat is going to be burning up calories and making a lot of heat. And you can think of brown fat as sort of wasting calories in your body. So it's metabolically active. Is that good or bad? Well, if you're talking about, weight regulation, then lots of people want more brown fat in their bodies because you can just burn off the calories, right? And lots of people are trying to find ways that they can increase brown fat in their bodies. Okay, so we have stem cells that can make, white and beige fat. And then we have stem cells that make muscle cells, but from that lineage, we can also make these special brown fat cells. Okay, now we have different areas in your body that can make fat as well. So people don't realize this, but the lining of your blood vessels, that would be called the endothelium, right? Those cells there lining your blood vessels can also make brown, white, and beige fat. That was just to, throw that in for a little bit of interest there. It's not going to be something I'll discuss here. But mainly, I want you to think about these stem cells that are making new fat cells. But it turns out that there's another place that fat cells can come from, and this is from the bone marrow, the hematopoietic lineage of cells. Those cells in the bone marrow can develop into myeloid cells, myeloid cells. And these are the precursors to immune cells in your body, the white blood cells in your body, okay? So generally you think of these myeloid cells and they're going to make some white blood cells, immune cells to help you fight infection in your body. But it turns out we now know that from the same lineage of immune cells, we can actually make new fat cells. So think about this. Now, coming from immune cells, we're actually making fat cells. We've seen this in animal models. For example, in mice between the ages of 8 to 16 weeks, we see these bone marrow progenitor fat cells, or BMP, bone marrow progenitor fat cells, right? And they make up about 5 to 25% of the total fat cell pool in those mice. And it's mostly found in the gonadal fat around the gonads, and also around the heart in the epicardial fat. So that's really interesting because we never realized that before. Now, these bone marrow derived progenitor cells, right, that have an immune lineage, they have different gene expressions. So with this type of fat cell, we see a lot more inflammatory cytokine production. So we're making a lot more of inflammatory substances, in fact, 2.5 times to 50 times higher than regular fat cells. So you have a whole lot more inflammation going on, and it's not surprising because those cells come from an immune cell lineage. We also see differences in mitochondrial and peroxisomal enzymes. These are enzymes that are related to metabolism, very important in metabolism, right? And these enzymes that are related to metabolism are much decreased in these special immune lineage fat cells. So you can see that, these fat cells are different from the regular fat cells. And, we know this happens in mouse models. Does this happen in humans? Yes, because when we've looked at bone marrow transplant patients, for example, and done subcutaneous biopsy of their fat right from the belly area, right under the skin, we find these special bone marrow progenitor fat cells, and it can be anywhere from 0 to 35% depending on the patient. And over time, we see more and more of these immune cell lineage fat cells. Okay, so the longer you are out from bone marrow transplant, the more of these cells will accumulate. And other studies have shown that these special immune lineage fat cells, they comprise roughly under 20% of total fat cells, but they do have a significant contribution to your physiology, and they have unique gene expressions, right? As I said, you have much increased inflammatory cytokine production with those types of fat cells. Ryden et al. In Cell Metabolism 2016 found that you have more of those immune type fat cells in obese patients. But interestingly, what I want to emphasize here is that another group, Gavin et al., have found that these specific immune fat cells are more likely to be found in female mice, right? So it seems like estrogen has a role here. So when they looked at mice that had had their ovaries removed, or they had no estrogen receptor, what we call the estrogen receptor knockout mice, right? These mice had much increased expression of these fat cells that came from that immune lineage. And when you took those mice that had their ovaries removed and you gave back estradiol, you gave them back the estrogen, those cell lines decrease. So you now saw a decrease in those immune cell lineage fat cells back to the levels that were seen in the wild type controls. There was no effect with progesterone. It was only with estradiol. So loss of estrogen stimulates the production of these specific fat cells, right, that come from immune cell lineage. And this then increases also the visceral fat in your body. So you can see that these changes are down to the cell level. Okay, so now we're going to go back a little bit to that brown fat, all right? As I said earlier, everybody wants to have a little bit more brown fat because then we waste more calories, we become more metabolically active. So that's kind of the holy grail. And there are lots of people trying to develop medications to stimulate more brown fat activity. So women, I have good news for you because in general, we actually have more brown fat activity, right? And we're more likely to find brown fat in women than in men. Okay, so that's the good news. And, basically everybody wants to have more brown fat. And one way you could stimulate more brown fat production is if you had some cold exposure. So if you went out in the cold for 2 hours for every day for about 4 weeks, you could increase the amounts of brown fat in your body. And actually we see this happen more with women. We activate more brown fat, we make more brown fat. So when you work with mice models and you remove the ovaries of the female mice, then that brown fat activity goes away. If you add the estradiol back, well, the brown fat activation comes back. So you can see the estrogens are very important here in brown fat activation. And it also promotes brown fat proliferation and differentiation with cold exposure, and 2 times more than seen in male mice. Okay, so yay for the estrogen, right? And also there are indirect effects of the estrogens because the estrogens can increase brown fat activity through the brain, what we call the hypothalamic neural circuits in the brain, and it activates the sympathetic nervous system, right? And once you activate the sympathetic nervous system and you have these activation of these, what we call the beta adrenergic receptors, right? Then we start to burn more fat in the brown fat. Okay, we can activate that brown fat. That's all great. But remember, this is under the influence of estrogen, and actually androgens tend to reduce brown fat activity, which is why we think men have less of that brown fat activity. Progesterone has been less studied, and we've seen some mixed results with progesterone, but I think there's a general consensus that very high levels of progesterone also inhibit, right, fat activity or brown adipose tissue activity. We see this in pregnancy when you have high levels of progesterone. Now, those women have decreased brown fat activity because of the higher levels of progesterone. Okay, so where are we now? Let's do a quick summary. So far, what we've talked about is that at menopause, when you lose or have decreased estrogen effects in your body, you have increased fat mass, increased percent body fat. Most of that fat is going to be visceral fat or ectopic fat and fat around the heart. Not good at all. Also, you're going to reduce lean mass. So you drop your muscle mass, you drop also some bone. Okay, so now your body composition changes and you become less metabolically active. Okay, so you can see, as I said earlier, that that brown fat activity that was to your benefit as a woman under the influence of estrogen also goes away, right? So again, another negative strike to your metabolism, because now you have less brown fat activity as well. Also, we find that you have increased fat cells now in all your fat deposits, primarily the visceral fat. Now, these fat cells are going to come, some of these are going to come from an immune cell lineage from your bone marrow, okay? And those types of progenitor fat cells are very different from your normal stem cell fat cells, okay? And they're different because they're much more inflammatory, coming from an immune lineage, right? And so we're going to have more circulating inflammatory cytokines causing inflammation, increasing your risk for heart disease, for strokes, for diabetes, and cancer in your body, and also things like fatty liver, right, with the cirrhosis and so forth. And we see this primarily with obesity and with menopause. So one way that I explain this to my patients is, if you may have heard of something called PCOS, or polycystic ovarian syndrome, okay? And this is a condition of androgen excess in women. And that means that the ratio of male hormones to female hormones is higher, okay? You have more of the androgenic effect, so that some of these women, have masculinizing features going on in their body, like increased body hair and so forth, all right? And what I tell my patients is, women, menopause is when women become more like men metabolically. Okay, that's why they call it menopause. Not really. Of course, we know the men's part comes from the menses, or monthly, right? So it relates to your periods. But I think it sticks in your head when you think about menopause as the time when women become more like men, right? Metabolically. And in fact, I think one quick and easy way to look at it is that when a woman hits menopause, she becomes a PCOS patient, right? Because that's a state, menopause is a state of relative androgen excess, okay? And so you can think of that patient as now being a PCOS patient. So it just makes it easier to conceive of, and also to treat that patient when you realize that, oh, at menopause, every woman develops PCOS. Okay, it's not quite PCOS, but they have that syndrome of the excess androgens, right? And that's why then they have increased insulin resistance, increased deposits of the visceral fat, metabolic syndrome. All these metabolic changes are related to PCOS, and we see them when women hit menopause as well. So that's why I think that's a quick and easy way to think about menopause. Now, here comes the important part, right? Of course, because I've talked about these changes in the body, and I stayed very superficial. I didn't want to go very deep because this is an episode I am specifically making for my patients, but also for CARM's patients, right? Who want to know what's happening in their bodies. So I didn't go into a lot of the molecular mechanisms and the different receptors and so forth. I just wanted to paint a general picture, and also to discuss a little bit what we can do about it. So you all saw that these changes come about when we have a drop in estrogen levels in the body. And so hormonal replacement is going to be something to seriously consider, okay? So now lots of endocrinologists and people who specialize in menopause are re-looking at hormonal replacement therapy because there's such an increased risk in heart disease and all the cardiometabolic complications, right, related to menopause. So you have to weigh the risks. And my first piece of advice is you really need to be talking to your doctor and having a serious consideration and a serious conversation around hormonal replacement therapy, right? So make sure you talk to your OBGYN, also to perhaps an endocrinologist or a menopause specialist, because again, now the recommendations are starting to shift because we see the much increased cardiometabolic risk to women after menopause. Before you hit menopause, you really have to do everything possible to optimize your body composition. We know that excessive weight gain during pregnancy is going to put you at high risk for obesity later on in life, and also at worsening of obesity during menopause, right? Weight gain in any phase of your life will increase your risk of increased fat gain during menopause. So at all stages of your life, you should be prioritizing your body composition, making sure that you optimize it such that you have as much lean mass as possible and reduce any excessive fat mass, okay? Again, for women, total percent body fat by DEXA, right? And that's a special x-ray, should be under 35%. And please, if you're doing the bioimpedance handheld thing at the gym, that is woefully inadequate. It's very inaccurate, and it's also not going to tell you how much visceral fat you have. So you really seriously should be asking for a DEXA body composition. That's capital DXA body composition. All right, that's very easy to get. It's very, very low radiation, very safe. We can even do it in kids. So there's no reason that we can't get a body composition to assess your body composition analysis to assess your risk. Now, in order to optimize your body composition, I've said this over and over again, you got to get enough protein. And in my experience, women across the entire life stage generally do not get enough protein. They really don't get enough good sources of protein and the right dose. Minimum, you're going to get 25 to 30 grams of whole protein from preferably animal sources, right? And that is per meal. Per meal. I'm going to emphasize that again. Per meal. And there have been studies that have shown that bolus per meal is really important. So there was one study where they had two groups of women, and in one group they said, okay, you know what, you're going to eat 90 grams of protein a day, and we don't care how you get it in. If you eat 10 grams now, you eat 20 grams later, as long as by the end of the day you hit your 90 grams, we're good. All right. And then the second group, they said, listen, you're going to get in 90 grams of protein, and you're going to do it this way. You're going to have 30 grams at breakfast, 30 grams at lunch, and 30 grams at dinner. All right. And the only group that had muscle synthesis was in the group that had 30, 30, 30, right? So it's important that you bolus correctly per meal. So it's 25 to 30 grams of protein per meal. You may have to go up the older you are because of something called anabolic resistance. But, you know, that's a minimum. And I find that most women are not hitting that minimum. It's really hard to convince women who are concerned about fat gain. It's really hard to convince them to eat. And, you know, I get a lot of resistance that way, but you do have to get in enough protein to preserve your lean mass. And you have to do resistance training. So yes, the cardio is great, but you can't just, live on the treadmill or on the elliptical, right? Or in your aerobics classes. You really have to get serious about some solid resistance training 2 to 3 times a week. Very important. I emphasize that. And again, my patients, at least, they'll always report getting on the treadmill, going for a run, getting on the bike. And how much resistance training did you do? I'm going to get to it. I don't really like resistance training. Okay, but if you're going to preserve your muscle mass, you got to get some resistance training, right? And of course, you have to decrease inflammation as much as possible. So this means addressing your sleep. You're not going to have great metabolic health if you have poor sleep, right? And you have to manage your stress, because I didn't talk about this, but there's a relationship between your stress hormones and also your sex hormones. So there's a crosstalk between cortisol and sex hormones. I didn't want to, again, get too technical in this episode, but you do have to manage your stress, because when you have chronic stress especially, that is going to shift your metabolism, and it will decrease brown fat activity even more. So you really want to manage that stress. And of course, you want to stop smoking or alcohol use, because those things are just going to increase inflammation in your body. Now, obviously, it's not easy to do all of this on your own, and there's a lot to keep in mind. And what I recommend is you can sign up for a free checklist on the things you can do to manage fat gain during menopause or perimenopause, and to learn about a program that I've designed to help women make that transition, that menopause transition well, to address this problem so that you don't have increase in fat mass and you don't struggle with that and with your body composition at menopause. So you can get that checklist and you can learn more about this program that I designed for my patients and just for women who are worried about this or have been struggling with this. You can go to bodycompforwomen.com, bodycompforwomen.com. All right, bodycompforwomen.com to get more information. Now, I will be doing another episode on men and fat gain and muscle loss, right? The changes in their body composition in another episode. And it seems like they might be separate, right? But I've already said at the beginning that whether you're a man or a woman, you're making the female hormones and you're also making the male hormones, just in different proportions, right? And so you're still going to have effects of both in your body. And I didn't want to overload this episode, but when I do that episode on men and how hormones affect their body, it'd be worth a listen for the women as well, because I'm going to go into some material that is actually for both men and women. Okay, so I hope I answered the questions that your patients ask, Carm, and I did talk about the fatty liver, so I made sure I put that in there. And again, if people want to know more, get that checklist on how to, manage fat gain during menopause and learn about this program that, is going to help you keep optimal body composition, go to bodycompforwomen.com. And if you have any other questions, please just come to my live Q&A sessions. I have them regularly. You can check them out on my website. And I'd love to hear what you're concerned about and answer any questions you may have around fat gain during menopause. Okay, I think I'm done for now. So signing out from VLMD Rounds, I'm Dr. Vivian Lowe, and I sing the body electric. Bye.